The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 p.m., just like it had every day for the past 8 months. Jerome rolled over in his narrow bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. The studio apartment above Chen's corner store wasn't much, but it was his. After 5 years behind bars, having your own key to your own door meant everything. He pulled on his work boots and grabbed his lunch bag from the tiny refrigerator. Peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. Same thing every night before his shift at the warehouse. Simple food for a simple life, which was exactly what his parole officer kept telling him he needed. The stairs creaked as he walked down to the street. Mrs. Chen was closing up her store, pulling the metal grates over the windows. She nodded at him politely but didn't smile. 8 months of being a quiet, respectful tenant, and she still watched him like he might bolt with her cash register at any moment. Jerome understood. He really did. When you've been labeled a criminal, people don't forget. They see the label before they see the person. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, applying for job after job, watching faces change the moment background checks came back. The warehouse job was the only place that gave him a chance, and even then, they stuck him on the night shift where fewer people had to see him. Walking down Maple Street, he passed the same buildings he'd grown up around. Tony's barber shop where his dad used to take him for haircuts. The playground where he'd played basketball until the streetlights came on. Miller's grocery where his mom sent him to buy milk and bread. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different now. A group of kids hung around the bus stop, probably around 16 or 17. One of them had the same hungry look Jerome remembered having at that age. The look that said the streets were offering answers that school and home weren't providing. Jerome wanted to stop to tell them what those answers really cost, but he kept walking. Getting involved meant drawing attention, and drawing attention meant trouble. His sister Keisha lived just 4 blocks away, but he hadn't seen her kids in 2 months. She loved him, he knew that, but love and trust were 2 different things. She had twin boys, 8 years old, and every time Jerome came around, she found reasons to keep them in their room or send them to their grandmother's house. It hurt, but he couldn't blame her. If he had kids, he'd probably do the same thing. The warehouse sat on the edge of town like a concrete fortress. Jerome swiped his ID card and nodded to Bill, the security guard. Bill was all right. He'd been locked up once too, back in the 80s, and he understood what it meant to try rebuilding from nothing. "Evening, Jerome. How you holding up?" "One day at a time, Bill. Just one day at a time." The warehouse floor stretched out like an airplane hangar, filled with boxes and pallets that needed moving. Jerome grabbed his equipment and got to work. Loading, unloading, organizing, counting. Simple work that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. He'd learned in prison that idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts led to bad decisions. His coworkers were decent enough. They didn't go out of their way to be friendly, but they didn't go out of their way to be cruel either. They called him by his name, included him in basic work conversations, and treated him like any other employee. It wasn't friendship, but it was respect, and respect was something he was still earning back 1 shift at a time. Around midnight, Jerome took his break outside behind the building. The city looked different at night, quieter and somehow more honest. During the day, everyone wore masks and played roles. At night, things stripped down to what they really were. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through job listings, same as he did every break. Delivery driver, store clerk, construction worker, all requiring clean background checks that he'd never pass. Mrs. Rodriguez, his parole officer, kept telling him to be patient. "Give it time," she'd say during their weekly meetings. "People forget. Things change." But Jerome had been watching, and people didn't forget. They might stop talking about it, but they remembered. The woman at the grocery store who counted her change twice when he paid. The mother who pulled her daughter closer when he walked past the playground. The landlord who'd wanted 3 months' rent up front instead of the usual 1-month deposit. He thought about the community center downtown where he volunteered twice a week. Ms. Washington, who ran the youth programs, had given him a chance to work with kids who reminded him of himself at that age. Angry, confused, looking for belonging in all the wrong places. The work didn't pay anything, but it felt important in a way his warehouse job never could. Those kids didn't know about his record. To them, he was just Jerome, the guy who helped with homework and listened when they needed to talk. Some of them came from broken homes. Others had parents working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. A few were already running with crowds that would lead them exactly where Jerome had ended up. Last week, a 15-year-old named David had asked him about making money fast. Jerome had seen that look before, the one that said school was pointless and the streets were calling. He'd spent an hour talking to David about patience, about building something real instead of chasing quick cash that came with quick consequences. David had listened, nodding in the right places, but Jerome could see the doubt in his eyes. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, telling kids to stay in school and follow the rules, while he stocked boxes for minimum wage and lived in a studio apartment because nobody would give him a real chance. How do you sell someone on the straight path when the straight path barely keeps you alive? Jerome finished his sandwich and headed back inside. 6 more hours until his shift ended. Then he'd walk home through the same neighborhood where everyone knew his story, but nobody knew his heart. He'd fallen asleep to the sound of sirens and delivery trucks, wake up in the afternoon and do it all over again. But every morning when he woke up in his own bed, in his own place, with his own key, he reminded himself that freedom was worth fighting for, even if that freedom came with judgment and suspicion and doors that stayed closed. Even if rebuilding meant starting from less than zero. Even if some days the weight of his past felt heavier than the boxes he moved all night. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant volunteering at the community center. David would probably be there along with a dozen other kids standing at the same crossroads Jerome had faced years ago. Maybe this time he'd find the right words. Maybe this time someone would listen and choose differently, or maybe not. But showing up was all he could do. Showing up and hoping that somewhere in the space between his mistakes and his efforts to make things right, there was room for something better. The warehouse hummed around him as he got back to work, and Jerome lost himself in the rhythm of honest labor, 1 box at a time. Tuesday night at the warehouse had been busier than usual. 3 trucks came in late, which meant Jerome didn't clock out until almost 7 in the morning. His shoulders ached from lifting boxes all night, and his feet hurt from standing on concrete for 10 hours straight. All he wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and sleep until the sun went down again. The morning air felt thick and humid, like rain was coming. Jerome walked his usual route home, past the closed shops and empty parking lots. Most people were just starting their day, grabbing coffee and heading to office jobs. He sometimes wondered what it would feel like to be one of them, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a briefcase instead of work gloves and a lunch bag. As he turned onto Elm Street, something caught his attention. A soft sound, almost like crying coming from the old Murphy building. The place had been empty for 2 years, ever since the factory moved operations overseas. The city kept talking about tearing it down, but nothing ever happened. Kids sometimes broke in to spray paint the walls or drink beer where adults couldn't find them. Jerome stopped walking and listened. There it was again, definitely crying, and it sounded young. Really young. Every instinct told him to keep walking. Getting involved in anything suspicious was the last thing he needed. Mrs. Rodriguez had made it crystal clear that even being in the wrong place at the wrong time could send him back to prison. But the crying continued, weak and scared, and Jerome found himself moving toward the building instead of away from it. The front door hung open, held by a broken chain that looked like it had been cut recently. Jerome peered inside, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The building smelled like mold and rust, with broken glass scattered across the floor. Sunlight streamed through dirty windows, creating patches of light and shadow. "Hello?" he called, softly. "Anyone in here?" The crying stopped suddenly, replaced by silence that felt even worse. Jerome stepped inside, his boots crunching on debris. He'd been in plenty of abandoned buildings growing up, but this felt different. Wrong. Like something bad had happened here. He followed the sound deeper into the building, past empty offices and a hallway lined with doors that led nowhere. In what used to be the main factory floor, he found her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting against a concrete pillar with her hands tied behind her back. Tape covered her mouth, and her wide brown eyes stared at him with a mixture of fear and hope. She wore a yellow school dress that was now dirty and torn and sneakers with cardo on characters on them. Jerome's heart started pounding. This wasn't some kid playing hide and seek or exploring where she shouldn't be. This was serious. This was the kind of situation that ended up on the evening news. "Hey there," he said gently, kneeling down a few feet away so he wouldn't scare her. "It's okay. I'm going to help you." The girl's eyes followed his movements as he looked around the empty space. No one else was here, but that didn't mean they wouldn't be back. Whoever did this might return at any moment, and Jerome being here with her would look like the worst possible thing. He pulled out his pocket knife, the same one he'd carried since he was 16. In prison, having a weapon meant trouble, but on the outside it was just a tool for opening boxes and cutting rope. Today it might save a life. "I'm going to cut these ropes, okay? Don't be scared." The rope was thick and had been tied tight enough to leave marks on her small wrists. Jerome worked carefully, trying not to hurt her while listening for any sound that might mean someone was coming back. When her hands came free, she immediately reached up to pull the tape from her mouth. "My daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "They said they're going to call my daddy." Jerome felt sick. This wasn't random. Someone had taken this child for money, which meant they'd planned it, which meant they'd be back. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Isabella. Isabella Rivera." "Okay, Isabella, my name is Jerome, and we need to get you out of here right now." He shrugged off his work jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was shivering, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. The jacket was too big for her, but it would have to do. "Can you walk?" She nodded and stood up on shaky legs. Jerome took her hand and led her toward the exit, moving as quietly as possible. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding someone. Every sound made him think they were about to be caught. They made it outside without seeing anyone, but Jerome knew this was just the beginning of his problems. In about 10 minutes, this little girl would be safe with police officers. In about 15 minutes, those same officers would want to know why a convicted felon was in an abandoned building with a kidnapped child. There was a payphone 2 blocks away outside the old laundromat. Jerome had seen it 100 times but never thought he'd need it. He picked up Isabella and carried her, partly because she was tired and partly because he wanted to get away from that building as fast as possible. "We're going to call the police now," he told her as they walked. "They're going to take you home to your family. Are you going to stay with me?" The question hit him harder than he expected. This little girl had just been through something terrible, and now she was trusting him to keep her safe. But staying meant questions he couldn't answer without destroying the life he'd been trying to rebuild. "The police officers are good people," he said. "They're going to take very good care of you." At the payphone, Jerome dialed 911 and waited for the operator to answer. 911, what's your emergency?" "I found a kidnapped child, a little girl named Isabella Rivera. She's safe now, but she needs help." "Sir, where are you located?" Jerome gave the address of the laundromat and hung up. In the distance, he could already hear sirens. Help was coming fast. He knelt down next to Isabella and zipped up the jacket around her. "Listen to me, okay? When the police get here, you tell them exactly what happened. You tell them someone bad took you, but you're safe now. Can you do that?" She nodded, still holding his hand. "What about you? Where are you going?" Jerome looked toward the approaching sirens, then back at this brave little girl who'd just survived something no child should ever experience. In a perfect world, he'd stay and make sure she got home safely. In a perfect world, the police would see him as a hero instead of a suspect. But this wasn't a perfect world. "I have to go now, Isabella. But you're going to be okay. Your daddy is going to be so happy to see you." He started to walk away, then turned back one more time. "You're very brave, you know that?" Jerome disappeared around the corner just as the first police car pulled up to the laundromat, leaving behind his jacket and the only person who could tell the world what really happened in that abandoned building. Jerome barely slept that Tuesday. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabella's frightened face and heard the sirens getting closer. He'd done the right thing, he knew that, but doing the right thing and having it look right were 2 very different things. By Wednesday morning, his worst fears started coming true. His phone rang at 11:30. Mrs. Rodriguez, his parole officer, never called unless something was seriously wrong. Jerome, I need you to come down to the station. Now. What's this about? Just get down here, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The police station on 4th Street was the same one where they'd booked him 5 years ago. Walking through those doors again felt like stepping backward in time. The desk sergeant looked at him like he remembered him, which he probably did. In a city this size, faces stuck around. Mrs. Rodriguez met him in the lobby, and her expression told him everything he needed to know. This was bad. Jerome, I want you to tell me exactly where you were yesterday morning between 6 and 8. Walking, home from work. Why? A little girl named Isabella Rivera was kidnapped Monday night and found Tuesday morning. There's security footage of you in the area where she was being held. Jerome's stomach dropped. Security cameras. He hadn't even thought about security cameras. Mrs. Rodriguez, I can explain. Don't say another word until we get upstairs. They put him in the same interview room where he'd confessed to armed robbery years ago. Gray walls, metal table, cameras in the corners. Detective Williams walked in carrying a thick folder and a cup of coffee that smelled better than anything Jerome could afford. Jerome Patterson. Been a while. Detective Williams had arrested him the first time. He was older now, grayer, but he still had the same way of looking at people like he could see right through their lies. We need to talk about yesterday morning. They showed him the footage. Grainy black and white video from a camera across the street, showing him walking toward the Murphy building, then coming out 20 minutes later carrying something wrapped in his jacket. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was. A man entering a building with nothing and leaving with a child. The girl says a man helped her, but she's too traumatized to give us much detail. Care to fill in the blanks? Jerome told them everything. Finding Isabella, cutting her free, carrying her to safety, calling 911. The truth sounded hollow in that sterile room, like a story someone made up to cover their tracks. So you just happened to be walking by an abandoned building and decided to investigate crying sounds? Yes. And after untying a kidnapped child, you just happened to disappear before officers arrived? I knew how it would look. Detective Williams leaned back in his chair. How what would look, Jerome? Helping a child in trouble? A black ex-con found with a kidnapped kid. Come on, detective. You know exactly how that looks. The questions went on for 3 hours. The same questions asked different ways, trying to find holes in his story. They wanted to know about his relationship with the Rivera family. Had he been watching the house? Planning this for weeks? Was this part of some larger scheme? Jerome answered everything honestly, but honesty wasn't enough. They had a kidnapped child, a building full of evidence, and an ex-convict who'd been there at the right time with the right explanation. In their world, coincidences like that didn't exist. By the time they let him go, the story was already on. The evening news. Not the whole story, just the part about police questioning a person of interest in the Rivera kidnapping case. They showed his mugshot from 5 years ago alongside a school photo of Isabella, letting viewers draw their own conclusions. Jerome walked home to find news vans parked outside his building. Reporters with cameras and microphones asking neighbors what they thought about having a suspected kidnapper living above the corner store. Mrs. Chen met him at the back door with an eviction notice. I'm sorry, Jerome, it's not personal, it's business. His phone had 17 missed calls. Keisha, his sister, had heard the news and wanted to know if it was true. The warehouse supervisor wanted to know when he'd be back to work, if ever. 3 reporters had somehow gotten his number and wanted interviews. Jerome sat on his narrow bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. 24 hours ago, he'd had a job, an apartment, and a slowly improving life. Now he had none of those things, all because he'd tried to help a child who needed saving. The worst part wasn't losing his job or his apartment. The worst part was watching people who'd started to believe in him lose that faith all over again. Bill, the security guard at the warehouse, had looked at him differently when the police came asking questions. The kids at the community center would hear about this and wonder if Jerome was someone they should trust or someone they should fear. Thursday morning brought more bad news. The real kidnappers had been caught trying to collect ransom money from Isabella's family. But instead of clearing Jerome's name, it made things worse. The police started wondering if he was part of a larger group, if the rescue had been staged to throw off the investigation. The local newspaper ran a story asking whether the justice system was too lenient with violent criminals. I didn't mention Jerome by name, but they didn't need to. Everyone knew who they were talking about. Radio talk shows debated whether ex-convicts should be allowed to live in family neighborhoods. Social media pages exploded with people sharing the story and their opinions about what should happen to men like Jerome. His sister called Thursday night crying. "Jerome, people are saying terrible things. My boys came home asking if their uncle is a bad man. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth, Keisha. I found a little girl who needed help, and I helped her." "But why did you run? If you didn't do anything wrong, why didn't you stay?" Jerome closed his eyes and tried to explain something that shouldn't need explaining. "Because men like me don't get the benefit of the doubt. We get blamed first, and maybe proven innocent later, if we're lucky." Friday brought news that Isabella's family wanted to speak with him. They'd heard his side of the story from the police and wanted to thank him personally. But Jerome was afraid to meet them. What if they looked at him and saw what everyone else saw? What if even the family of the child he'd saved couldn't get past his criminal record? The community center called and asked him not to come in for a while. "Just until things settle down," Ms. Washington explained. "The parents are worried, you understand." Jerome understood. He understood that 5 years of trying to rebuild his life could disappear in a single news cycle. He understood that being a hero and being a suspect could look exactly the same depending on who was watching. He understood that some stains never wash out no matter how hard you scrub. Saturday morning, he packed his few belongings into 2 garbage bags and prepared to start over somewhere else. Again. But this time, he wasn't running from something he'd done wrong. He was running from something he'd done right, which somehow felt even worse. Jerome had been staying at the Sunrise Motel for 3 days when the first unexpected phone call came. The motel sat on the edge of town where nobody asked questions about why you paid in cash or why you didn't have much luggage. His room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning chemicals, but it was cheap and the manager didn't watch the news. "Is this Jerome Patterson?" The voice belonged to a woman he didn't recognize. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Dr. Rebecca Foster. I'm a child psychologist working with Isabella Rivera. I wonder if we could meet." Jerome almost hung up. The last thing he needed was more involvement in this mess. But something in the woman's voice made him hesitate. "Why would you want to meet with me?" "Because I think there's more to this story than what people are hearing." They met at Rosie's diner on the other side of town, where the coffee was strong and the booths were far enough apart for private conversations. Dr. Foster was younger than Jerome had expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She carried a folder thick with papers and drawings. "Isabella has been having nightmares," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "But she's also been talking and drawing." She opened the folder and pulled out several pieces of paper covered in crayon marks. Stick figures in bright colors, a building with broken windows, and in the center of one drawing a tall figure in dark clothes with gentle hands. "She draws you over and over," Dr. Foster explained. "Always the same way. Always helping her." Jerome stared at the drawings. In Isabella's world, captured in simple lines and bright colors, he wasn't a criminal or a suspect. He was just someone who'd helped when she needed help. "She remembers everything about that morning," Dr. Foster continued. "How carefully you cut the ropes so you wouldn't hurt her. How you gave her your jacket because she was cold. How you told her she was brave." "I don't understand why you're telling me this." "Because the police interviewed her 3 times and each time she describes the same thing. A man who smelled like soap and hard work, not cologne. A man with gentle hands who spoke softly and made her feel safe. The kidnappers wore expensive cologne and rough perfume. You didn't." Jerome felt something shift inside his chest. Someone believed him. Not just believed him, but had evidence that he was telling the truth. "There's something else," Dr. Foster said. "Isabella keeps asking about you. She wants to know if you're okay. She's worried that people think you're bad when you're actually good." Before Jerome could respond, his phone rang again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize with a local area code. "Mr. Patterson? This is Rosa Martinez. I clean offices. Downtown." The woman spoke with a thick accent and sounded nervous, like she wasn't sure she should be calling. "I saw you on the news. They're saying bad things about you, but I know they're wrong." "How do you know that?" "Because I saw you that morning. I work nights cleaning the offices across from the old Murphy building. I was finishing up around 7, and I saw you come out of that building carrying something wrapped in your jacket. You weren't running like someone who did something bad. You were moving like someone protecting something precious." Jerome gripped the phone tighter. "Did you tell the police this?" "I tried, but they said they'd call me back. That was 4 days ago. I don't think they want to hear what I have to say." Rosa Martinez was afraid to get involved, but she couldn't stay quiet while an innocent man was destroyed by lies. She'd seen enough injustice in her 53 years to recognize it when it happened right in front of her. "I have security footage from the building where I work," she continued. "It shows you walking normal, not sneaky. It shows you caring for whatever you were carrying. People who steal children don't act like that." After Rosa hung up, Dr. Foster leaned forward across the table. "There are people who want to help you. Jerome, you just have to let them." The next morning brought another surprise. Jerome was drinking coffee in his motel room when someone knocked on the door. Through the peephole, he saw a well-dressed Hispanic man in his 40s, holding a briefcase and looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Patterson? My name is Carlos Rivera. I'm Isabella's father." Jerome opened the door slowly. This was the last person he'd expected to see. Carlos Rivera was smaller than Jerome had imagined, with tired eyes and worry lines that probably hadn't been there a week ago. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in the past few days. "Care, I come in?" They sat in the 2 chairs by the window and Carlos got straight to the point. "The police told me what you said happened. My daughter told her doctor what she remembers. I believe both of you. Mr. Rivera, Please let me finish." Carlos's voice cracked slightly. "Those animals took my little girl from her bedroom while my wife and I slept down the hall. For 18 hours I didn't know if I'd ever see her again. You brought her back to me." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a photograph. Isabella in a clean yellow dress smiling at the camera, holding a drawing of a tall man in dark clothes. "She made this for you. She wants me to find you and say thank you." Jerome stared at the picture. In the drawing, stick figure Isabella was, holding hands with stick figure Jerome, both of them smiling under a bright yellow sun. "The media is telling a different story," Carlos continued. "They're making you out to be some kind of monster. But I know monsters, Mr. Patterson. I looked into the eyes of the men who took my daughter. You're not a monster. You're a hero." That afternoon, Carlos Rivera called a press conference. He stood in front of his house with his wife and Isabella, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras. "My daughter is alive because a brave man named Jerome Patterson risked everything to save her," Carlos said, his voice steady and clear. "While everyone else walked past that building, he stopped to help. While everyone else minded their own business, he chose to get involved. The police have caught the real criminals, and it's time we stopped treating Mr. Patterson like one of them." Isabella stepped forward, holding her drawing for the cameras to see. "Jerome saved me," she said in a small but clear voice. "He's good." The press conference was broadcast live on 3 local news stations and shared thousands of times on social media within an hour. For the first time in a week, Jerome's story was being told the right way. But the damage was already done. Jerome had lost his job, his apartment, and his place in the community. Good press couldn't fix that overnight. What it could do was start conversations. Dr. Foster began speaking publicly about the case, explaining how trauma affects memory and why Isabella's insistent account should be trusted. Rosa Martinez finally got her chance to speak to detectives, bringing security footage that supported Jerome's timeline. Other witnesses came forward, people who'd seen him in the neighborhood over the past 8 months, always walking alone, always minding his own business, never causing trouble. The story was changing, but Jerome wondered if it was too late for the change to matter. 2 weeks after Carlos Rivera's press conference, Jerome was still living at the Sunrise Motel. The story had changed in the newspapers and on social media, but changing a story and changing a life were two different things. He'd become famous for all the right reasons now, but famous didn't pay rent or put food on the table. He was eating breakfast at Rosie's diner when Carlos Rivera walked in, looking around until he spotted Jerome in the back booth. This time Carlos wasn't alone. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair followed him, along with a teenage boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Jerome, this is my wife, Patricia, and my son Miguel. We've been wanting to thank you properly." Patricia Rivera had the same gentle strength Jerome recognized in mothers who'd been through hell and come out protecting their families. She sat down across from him and took his hands in hers. "I don't have words for what you did," she said. "You brought our daughter home. You brought our family back together." Miguel, maybe 16 years old, looked uncomfortable but determined. "My friends were saying stuff about you at school. Bad stuff. I set them straight." It was such a simple statement, but it hit Jerome harder than he expected. This kid had stood up for him when he didn't have to, when it would have been easier to stay quiet. "There's something else," Carlos said. "I own a construction company, Rivera and Sons. I know you're looking for work." Jerome had learned not to get his hopes up about job offers. "Mr. Rivera, I appreciate the thought, but most places won't hire someone with my record. I'm not most places, and I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job because you're exactly the kind of man I want working for my company. Someone who does the right thing even when it costs him everything." The job was real. Benefits, decent pay, and a chance to work with his hands building something instead of just moving boxes around a warehouse. Carlos introduced Jerome to his crew as the man who'd saved his daughter, not as an ex-convict looking for a second chance. It made all the difference. Jerome's first project was helping build a new playground at Lincoln Elementary School. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who'd been treated like a danger to children was now building a place where children would play safely for years to come. Luis, the crew foreman, was about Jerome's age and had been working construction for 15 years. He didn't ask about Jerome's past or treat him differently because of it. "Carlos says you're good people," Luis said on Jerome's first day. "That's all I need to know." Working construction was harder on the body than the warehouse, but easier on the soul. At the end of each day, Jerome could see what he'd accomplished. Concrete poured, walls framed, playground equipment assembled, building instead of just surviving. 3 weeks into the job, Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by the worksite for one of her regular check-ins. Jerome was worried she'd have problems with him working around a school, but she surprised him. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, she said, watching Jerome help install swing sets. "I've seen a lot of men come out of prison. Most of them just try to stay out of trouble. Very few of them risk their freedom to save a child. You're one of the good ones, Jerome." Coming from Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd seen everything and trusted nobody, that meant something. The community center called a month later. Ms. Washington had been watching the news and wanted Jerome to come back to working with the kids. Some of the parents were worried before, she admitted. But they've been asking questions, reading the real story. They want their children to meet someone who understands that making mistakes doesn't make you a bad person. Jerome's first day back at the community center felt like coming home. David, the 15-year-old who'd been asking about making quick money, was waiting for him with a shy smile. "I saw you on TV," David said. "My mom says you're a real hero." "I'm not a hero, David. I'm just someone who tries to do better than I used to." "That's what makes you a hero, though, right?" Jerome spent that evening helping kids with homework and listening to their problems. Some of them had heard his story and wanted to know what prison was really like. Others just wanted help with math or someone to talk to about troubles at home. It didn't matter why they came. What mattered was that they felt safe enough to keep coming. Dr. Foster called with updates about Isabella's progress. The little girl was doing well in therapy, sleeping better, and had started asking when she could see Jerome again. "She's been writing you letters," Dr. Foster explained. "Her parents think it might help both of you if you could meet properly, this time." They met at the park on a Saturday afternoon. Isabella ran up to Jerome like they were old friends, carrying a folder full of drawings and letters she'd made for him. "I knew you were good," she said, hugging his legs. "Even when people on TV said bad things, I knew they were wrong." Isabella's trust was absolute and uncomplicated. She didn't care about his criminal record or what people might think. She only knew that he'd helped her when she needed help, and that made him good in her eyes. They spent an hour at the playground Jerome had helped build. Isabella showed him how high she could swing and asked him to push her on the merry-go-round. Patricia and Carlos watched from a bench, smiling at their daughter's laughter. "She's been different since she met you again," Patricia told Jerome. "Lighter, like she's not carrying as much fear." 6 months after the rescue, Jerome moved into a real apartment in a decent neighborhood. Not fancy, but clean and safe, with neighbors who nodded hello instead of crossing the street when they saw him coming. He'd started taking night classes at the community college, studying to become a certified contractor. Carlos was helping pay for the courses, but Jerome insisted on earning every grade himself. "Education is the one thing nobody can take away from you," Carlos had said. "No matter what happens, no matter what people think, what you know stays with you." The local newspaper did a follow-up story 6 months later, checking in on Jerome and Isabella. The reporter found Jerome at the construction site, wearing a hard hat and teaching a new crew member how to read blueprints properly. "Do you ever regret stopping to help that morning?" the reporter asked. Jerome thought about everything that had happened. Losing his job, his apartment, his reputation, being treated like a criminal when he'd acted like a hero, starting over from nothing again. "No," he said finally. "I regret that it took me so long to understand that doing the right thing isn't about what it costs you. It's about who you choose to be when nobody's watching and everything's on the line." A year later, Jerome was promoted to crew chief on his first major project. Isabella started second grade and still sent him drawings every few weeks. David graduated high school and got into college with help from a scholarship program Jerome had started for at-risk youth. Jerome's past hadn't disappeared. The mistakes were still there. The prison record still showed up on background checks. But now those things were part of a larger story. A story about second chances and the courage to take them. About communities that could learn to see people as more than their worst moments. About little girls who could teach adults what it really meant to recognize good when you saw it.